All right, hello and welcome. How's everyone doing today? We are here to talk about architecture testing in .NET. So, before we get too carried away, this webinar is being recorded and live streamed on our YouTube channel. This will be made available afterwards. If you want to email with all of the supporting links to the things that are shown in today's webinar, make sure you sign up at the URL that's included in the comments or that's included in the description. And then that way you can get the email that will include a link to this video in addition to the supporting links. If you have any questions along the way, please feel free to post in chat. We do run a subscribers only chat, so be aware of that as well. All right. So in today's webinar, we're going to look at architecture testing in .NET. We're going to take a look at what are the architecture tests, what are some ideas for those. We'll talk about common tests. We'll talk about some ways to organize tests. We'll look at ArchUnitNet. I'll share some resources. And then if you have any questions along the way, I'll also be watching the chat. Okay, so before we get into the code, let's talk about what are architecture tests. So architecture tests. What we're looking at here is it's the way to make sure that the system that is getting designed and the system that you're designing architecturally, you want to make sure that your architectural decisions are being maintained in the code and that they're being carried through. With architecture testing, you want to make sure you set those rules and principles and then that they're actually getting enforced. Now, that said, why would we want to do this? It's going to help your code to be consistent because the guidance you have is typically consistent throughout the solution. It's going to allow you to enforce best practices. And when I say enforce, this isn't going to be something where you're sitting at the code base and looking at it and going, well, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. We can automate it for some of the things. So today I'm going to show you ArchUnitNet, which allows us to do architectural tests for .NET projects. This will allow us to do some automation that we can then later on use in our CI/CD. So those best practices can also be automated. And it also helps you to find unintended deviations. Maybe you have a new developer who's working on the solution and starts to bring in some bad practices. Like maybe they're starting to make everything public when something needs to be protected or private or internal. There are tools out there that can allow you to check for that so that you don't have to look at in a code review and go, okay, did they follow my guidance? You can run it as part of tests and then you'll get that feedback right away rather than having to wait for a code review to get to that. Now you may hear architectural tests also called something called fitness tests. And there are different other tests as well, but we're going to talk about some of the things that we test with when talking with our clients. So when you're working with these tests, they can identify weaknesses in design and implementation. Now I know some of you are like, oh yes, I get to architect a system, and you're lucky enough to have it as a greenfield system, as in no code's written, and let's just build it today. However, not all of us are that lucky. Sometimes we have to do architectural decisions around legacy code. That means the code is written. That means when we put these tests into play, we may find technical debt. We may find the weaknesses in their design and implementation that need to get corrected over time. So be aware that you might have ideas of things that are proposed during design and are greenfield, but these rules also apply to legacy code. Again, this allows you to ensure that your architecture is going to evolve over time without deviating from your critical design goals. So you may say that we have a certain layout that we need, that we have maybe certain projects, and projects can't talk to each other or depend on each other, or they can. All those rules will evolve over time, and then you have automation that can help with that. These tests think of them as like guardrails. They help you to stay aligned, stay focused with the purpose, and also prevent violations. And the key thing to note with architectural tests are that they're typically aligned with some kind of architectural qualities. So we're talking about things like maintainability, readability, scalability, performance, security, things of that nature. You may be testing for one of the ilities, you may be testing for multiple ilities. But that's the main focus with architecturals, is that there's usually an ility or an architectural quality that's associated with what you're looking at. And what's nice too is that if you have an automated state, you'll get that continuous feedback on the status of the system as changes are being made. And then again, think of it as preventative maintenance. You're going to pick up those deviations in dev or in a lower environment and not catching them as they're going into prod. So what are some benefits of architecture testing? Again, you're enforcing your standards consistently. If you write the rules to check consistently, then they will be enforced consistently. And if you're dealing with greenfield, this will prevent the technical debt because it'll catch those violations early on. Or if you're in legacy code bases, which is super common for the stuff I deal with, we can identify technical debt that has gotten in there. It allows you to make your code base a little more maintainable, a little more readable, depending on the rules that you're bringing into play. And what's nice with architecture testing is it can support continuous integration and continuous delivery. Can. However, I have to stress that there are different types of architectural tests out there. Many can be automated, which is what I'm going to show today, but there's still manual tests as well. So things like maybe compliance checks and legal checks might have to be done manually, and you might not be able to use libraries around that to automate it. If that's the case, just understand that manual architectural testing is there where you have to look at the code and say, okay, are we still staying within these compliance guidances? Now, there might be some other tools out there to help you. Maybe you're dealing with accessibility, so something like PALI or PA11Y. It's an accessibility testing framework that could help with stuff like that. But we aren't getting into the specialized architectural quality tests per se, because there's so many other tools out there that would be better in another webinar for the ones that can be automated. Again, sometimes you have to do these things manually. All right, so let's talk about some common architecture testing scenarios. The ones that I'm going to mention here today, not all of these have demos, and not all of these are going to be done by code. And I'll point that out. So something you know with Nimble Pros is we talk a lot about clean architecture, created a course on it, but you can have rules that are written around it to prevent the dependencies. So we're going to talk about later on how we have a core and that our core doesn't know about the external dependencies. And that's going to be one of the projects that we use when we talk about how to build the rules code-wise. So we're going to be able to say that core shouldn't reference our use cases, core shouldn't reference our interfaces, core shouldn't reference the web. And then when it does depend on other layers, we could say that it should reference those as well. Now, naming conventions, this is thinking about like readability and consistency in your code base. So something like maybe you want repositories named consistently, or maybe you have data transfer objects that you want named consistency, for example. You can also say, no, they should not be named this. So maybe you're at a spot where you're like, I don't like having DTOs in my name, so they should not contain DTO. In the example that I have shown here, got my laser, not my laser pointer, my zoom. We're going to zoom in a little bit so you can see. So I have a rule. Now, we're using XUnit for the project I'm going to show you, which is eShop on Web. And you can see that I'm checking to see if they're implementing an iAggregate root interface, that their name should end with aggregate. And when we look at the code, we'll show you this a little bit better because I had to change the code so you could see a positive as well. But these are things like, so we have these catalog brand and catalog item, catalog type. We have some types that are implementing iAggregate root that don't have aggregate at the end of their name. So again, doing naming conventions like that, you can do that. You can do code placement as well. So if you want to say that my entities all live in core, they should not live elsewhere. Or you want to say something like all interfaces need to live in core and should not be elsewhere. Things like that you can do. Again, you could say that they live in a certain layer. You can get all the way down into the namespace. You could say that they belong in a namespace but reference some other way. Now there are also some technology specific rules. Now this particular one I wish I could demo, but I don't have it built here for today. So you can restrict your technologies and frameworks to a certain layer. So I could say, only show my entity framework core and lock it down to this layer. So we don't have EF core references in, like for example, web. Web shouldn't be talking directly to the database anyhow. So we can write rules around that. Now a question I've gotten as I talk about these rules is, when do you know what rules to include and when do you know what rules to not even worry about? And it's going to all go back to, well, I'm not wearing the shirt today, but to my other Nimble Pro shirt, which says, it depends. The depth of the rules that you write for your architecture tests are going to depend on what you want to really enforce. I can't stress this enough because newer architects are like, oh, I have all the rules, I need to implement all the rules. And that's not true. You do not need to implement all of the rules. It should not be exhaustive, but it should be at least enough to cover the code that you need to code to ensure that your guidance is being followed. You can look at things like interfaces and are they in particular namespaces and are they being implemented properly. You can check to see if things are being implemented within different access levels. I think that's later on. We'll talk about that as well. You can look at assembly boundaries. So for example, let's make sure that our code and source does not refer to anything in the tests. You can also do it so that your client-facing sites are not relying on admin portals. This is something that I've seen a lot in my career. I've dealt a lot with websites that have admin portals managing them, and I always have to explain why you want to keep those separated. You really don't want to have those tied together at all, because the last thing you need is your client-facing site to be in a way that it can be exploited, and now they find an easier way to get to admin because there's that connection. Let's try to keep them separated. I have a test example that I'll show with eShop on web, and we'll talk about what we probably would want to do instead. If you're doing domain-driven development, you'll know that you really don't want to mix your bounded contexts. And you don't want your bounded contexts to talk directly to each other. There are different strategies you can deal with for that. Such as the anti-corruption layer. So when you're dealing with things like that, you can put rules in place to say this context should not talk to this other context. What's nice too is that we can get into dependencies, and so we could say that, our source folder, so that's where we're going to have our application. In our case, we have web, we have application core, Blazor admin, Blazor shared, public API, infrastructure. So those are all within our source, but we can also make sure that those don't have references to our test frameworks. So in our production, do we really need to have references to things like XUnit or NUnit or NSubstitute? Probably not. Also, if you're like me where you have to deal with a lot of data generation, you probably don't need things like bogus in your source. You're probably dealing with real data and can move that to your test folder. So assembly boundaries are another architectural test that you can build and then ensure that people are following that guidance. Security and compliance, I don't have a good demo for today, but basically what we're going to deal with for that is we'll show the access restrictions and avoiding sensitive data in logs. Now in a future blog post on the NimblePros blog, I will be showing how you can enforce access restrictions, because I do want to show something like, what if we want it so that our entities only have private setters and they shouldn't be anything else? So I'm going to write that test in a future blog post. I just don't have it here for the demo because I wanted to make sure I showed other things first. All right, any questions so far about what are our architectural tests or what you should include or what you shouldn't include. Like I said, we do run a subscribers only chat stream, and that is again just something we do to make sure that we have our chat coming through clearly with people who care about the materials versus somebody who just randomly pops in and pops right back out. Hello and welcome, Hugh. All right, so we talked about what are architecture tests and why we would want to use them. But how do we organize them? Well, organizing them depends on what are you covering. There's the It Depends shirt. So, what kind of tests are you going to have for your architecture tests? What kind of coverage do you have? That will tell you as to how you want to organize them. Now, the code, when we get into it, I will show you has different points to make. So don't look at the code and go, oh, this is a good way to organize it. I will talk about different organizing strategies, but I will also tell you don't do what I have in there because it is a demo of individual pieces and not really a good overall demo. And I'll explain that a little bit when we get into there as well. But again, it always goes down to the it depends. But keeping it as a separate test project is ideal. So what you'll see in our demo, eShop on Web, is there's a test folder. And so I'll create another project just called Architecture Tests. And so this is the strategy I'm following within here. Now, when I'm dealing with .NET, my architecture tests are typically going to be solution-based. So I will have a architecture tests project for the solution. If you're dealing with multiple solutions, I've seen some people who have to manage systems and then do architecture tests around systems, then you'll figure out that your architecture test for that might be at a solution level and pointing at different references that way. For today's demo, we're going to just take it at a solution level, staying with the projects that we already have. So small scale. The thing to keep in mind with the test projects is that they need to refer to the other projects that you're testing. All of them. And if you do need to do architecture testing around other things that are in test projects, you may need to include those as well. Now, when we're talking about the tests, you could identify or align your tests with your architectural layers or domains. So let me show you what I have here. So we've got our architecture tests, and then you could do something like layers tests. So I could say maybe you have a controller layer and a service layer and a data layer. Or maybe you have a core layer and an infrastructure layer, a use cases layer, and a web layer, and an admin layer. Let's add that admin layer in there too. So you could do this whole layers. Or maybe you want to do this, and then you'll see here there's like dependencies and dependency rules and circular dependency tests. Naming conventions. Maybe you want to order your tests by what they're testing. So this could be like naming conventions, and then you could do things like, are we going to check our core naming versus our use case naming, or is it consistent across the board? And then something like assembly boundaries. So you can organize your tests however you choose. My advice to you is use the organization that makes sense for your solution and use it for the way that you're organizing your tests. So if it makes sense to group it by layers, then group it by layers. If it makes sense to group it by test purpose, then do it by test purpose. If it makes sense to have folders for the layers, then the test purpose is underneath that. That's fine too. Again, it goes back to you need to do an organization that makes sense for you and your current setup. Now you could also do things like grouping your tests by rule categories as well. And so you might see something like folders or namespaces for grouping, possibly, again, by the purpose. You could have things like integration rules and checking your dependencies, and then doing something like coding standards for naming conventions, attributes, and other patterns. And then something else that they recommend is creating reusable rules. Now, when it comes to the demo, I'm going to do the screenshots first, and then we'll jump into the code. They're going to be slightly different, and that's just because at the end I do a combination of some of the rules. And so I'll show you why you would want to do them as reusable rules. But reusable rules are static. It's a static class with static rules. And that reusability and the modularity will make it easier to maintain in the long run. Okay. So we're using ArchUnitNet, and we're using eShop on Web. I'm going to zoom into eShop on Web just so you can see. So this is eShop on Web. If you've been in the .NET space a while, this will sound very familiar. This was the Microsoft solution that now NimblePros maintains. So if you go to github.com/NimblePros/eShop on Web, you'll see this solution there, with the exception of this architecture tests. So architecture tests, this is our edition for today's webinar. And after this webinar, I'll get it into a branch out there so that you all can see it. All right, so we have, you can see we've got the application core, we've got a Blazor admin, a Blazor shared, if we've got an app host, we've got infrastructure, public API, and web. Some of the tests that I'm going to show include things like cores should not be relying on any of these. And then the one I like to make sure is that web is not related to admin, amongst other things. So we'll take a look at the code, but first let's talk through some of the ways to get started. So first, you need to install a package. It's tngtech.archunitnet. So do an install package or get it from NuGet. That's the package that you want. That's the base package. The second thing you need to know is which of the additional packages you need. So this is going to be on whatever your test framework is. So NUnit, XUnit, or MS Test are supported. For today's demos, XUnit is what's already in play in the tests, so we're going to show it with XUnit. Now these are going to be some common using statements that you'll see at the top of many of the files. You may want to deal with that. There's ArchUnitNet domain, the loader, the fluent, and then that using static ArchUnitNet.fluent.archrule definition. I have to call out the using static line because there have been many times where I've been working in these tests and I go to run them and I see that dreaded red squiggle of, hey, you forgot something. And I look at it, and it's usually on the check. And I'll show you what the check is, because you build a rule, and then you check the rule. And I look at it, and I see this red squiggle, and go, And then I'm like, wait a minute, I have to add the using static. Once you add the using static, that red squiggle goes away. So I'll show you that little gotcha. So once you have the packages installed, so again, the base package, as well as the package for your testing framework, then you can go ahead and create another testing project. So what I do for this one is I create a test project with XUnit. Now I have a helper class, and the reason why I have a helper class is because I don't want to have to write this everywhere. There are probably other ways that you want to implement it, but for me this is where my brain went to when I first created it. So that's where these live, and I'll show you that when we get into the code. But things I'm going to point out. So you need to build your architecture first, because what's going to happen is you have this architecture, and then you have these rules, and then you go and you say, okay, this rule, check it for this architecture. So does this architecture actually meet this rule? Now this particular one, again, eShop on Web. So we're having assemblies for each one of our layers, and then we're going to load all those assemblies, and we're going to build it. And this is going into this architecture type. Notice here we have this arch loader, so it's an architecture loader, and you do load assemblies. Now how did I choose which assemblies? These are going to be all of the assemblies that I'm dealing with in source. I'm not going to be doing the tests folder. It didn't make sense. So again, everything goes back to it has to make sense for what you're working with. All right, so we've installed our packages. We've created our architecture. Now let's actually look at some of the layers, because if you're doing tests, layers are probably a common thing you'll deal with. So what I have for my layers is, you're going to see there's this iObject provider with the iType. And then I'm going to say get all the types that are in this particular assembly. These assemblies, again, are what we were referring to on the previous slide. And we're going to call it as core layer, as Blazor admin layer, as Blazor shared layer. This is to be clear when our messages come out. You'll see where these appear, where core layer and Blazor admin layer. So use as to make it clear as to what that layer represents. And again, just so you can see as I zoom out, that we have layers for each one of our layers in eShop on Web. All right. The next thing we'll go is into the ideas for what could you test. So you can check a layer's dependencies. Now, what I initially did was I checked to see, make sure core doesn't depend on each one of these individually. And that's just to get a feel for, okay, how does this work? Does this make sense? Now the demo I'm going to show you here, and you'll see in a few slides, is that we can actually combine this and say it should not depend on Blazor admin, and it should not depend on Blazor shared, and it should not depend. So we'll get into the and here very shortly. Another thing you can do is, let's see, I don't know what this will do, so we'll see if it actually updates the layout there. But what you can do, and we'll look at the code, is you'll see the repository. So I want to say that repository must include repository in the name if it implements iRepository. Now the rassignable is, so this is the syntax that you're seeing is for ArchUnitNet. There's the assertions, and there's a lot of different things that we can test. But the thing comes to, there's a rule, so that's what this iArch rule is. And then you can call check. Now for me, the reason why you're seeing my arch rule and my check as separate lines is because later on I will pull arch rules out. But for demo, you could see what they look like. Now you could say something like, all right, maybe all my aggregate roots, so again in domain-driven design, maybe your aggregate roots should end with aggregate, so it's clear that these are aggregates just by looking at them. Well, we can look at that, and if we look at those, then the thing that we need to watch out for there is how do they work. Now with this notation for the rassignable, it's a little bit easier to read. You don't have to worry about the full namespace. You can just say, are they the type of iAggregate root, and then do they end with aggregate? So you can get to that layer of detail. And you'll see that I'm checking the entire architecture. Now, just like I say that my web and my admin should be separated, my web and my API should also be separated. I don't want my web to depend on the API. My web can call the API, but it shouldn't have that dependency, that tight coupling. And so this is a rule here. Now, giveaway on this is you can see the green check mark, so you know that this is already a passing test. Now when I come into a project and I'm looking at the different layers and I have to build an architecture or testing suite for them, I'll look at it and I will kind of guess at how the layers should work. But again, that whole, I don't like having my web depending on my admin. I want that separated. So when I was working with eShop on Web early on, this was one of the first tests that I built, was to make sure my web and my admin were separated. And sure enough, they are not. There's a red X there. Web should not depend on Blazor admin. They depend on Blazor admin. Now what I like about using ArchUnitNet with XUnit and with our tooling in Visual Studio is I can see the why. Where's the failure? And this is what's critical because failures inevitably happen. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see. So I've got this test in my web layers test. I talk about how the typesetter web layers should not depend on Blazor admin layer because. So notice that that's where the Blazor admin layer and web layer come into play. Those are those as my layer helpers. So they should be independent of each other. This is the because statement. So just to go back so you can see. So you saw the as for this, and you saw the as for this, and then you also saw the because all in the messaging on the next screen. So messaging matters, makes for a better user experience. But then again, why is this failing? Well, hold up, what do we got going on? Oh look, we have our controller, our web controller, our user controller does depend on authorization that's in Blazor admin. Maybe we can pull out our identity into a better spot. What's going on there? So that's something for us to look into for that. And why is our web extension service collection extension depending on Blazor admin services configuration? So notice it tells you exactly how they're violating. So we'll have to look at the code. But again, building these tests can help you to see, I don't want these together, I want these separated, and when you run it, you can see, oh, this is not what I anticipated. Now, you saw that I had the iArch rules separated from the check statements, and that was so that I could pull them out. So after I did the screenshots of the tests for our core layer, what I ended up doing is pulling up each one of those iArch rules, pulling them out of the tests and just putting them above. But then I created this last one here, which of course should not depend on external layers. The key for this particular demo is going to be the and. So you have the ability to use and or, but those are used specifically when you're combining architectural rules. So I could say this and this, or this, or this, not, and parentheses to group them. So that's how you combine the rules. So next, let's go look at the code. Any questions? All right, let's get into the code. So I have eShop on web here. My Solution Explorer. And just so you can see, we have this core, admin, shared, the app host, the infrastructure, public API, and web. Those are the layers that we're working with. Now, you'll see I've already created architecture tests. So if you want to follow along with this and you're watching the video afterwards, you can always pause it. Unfortunately, you can't pause me when I'm live. But if you pull a copy down of the NimblePro's eShop on Web repo, and then in the test folder, create a new project. This again uses XUnit in their tests. So you would do a new XUnit test project, and then you need to add the package for TNG. So if we go to architecture tests, I'm going to close some folders so they're not distracting us right now. We'll look at dependencies. And then you can see here for our packages, there's TNG Tech, ArchUnitNet, XUnit. That's the key one that I need for this particular one. Now, for those who are following who are like, I can't tell what it shows down at the bottom there. So this is version 0.11.1. So you have an idea what version I'm working with. Okay. So with our architecture unit tests, the way I have them organized right now is a little chaotic on purpose so I can show you different styles. But the helpers is pretty straightforward. So as I mentioned, I have a helper class. And the reason why I have a helper class is because I don't want to have to declare these assemblies everywhere. I only want them in one spot. And so I have my assemblies for each one of my layers. So core, again, the Blazors, infrastructure, the API, and the web. And then I'm loading my architecture in one spot as well, because my architecture shouldn't change at all for my solution. This is the entire architecture that I want to test. If I want to test like classes or types or property members, things like that, we can get that low. But in general, you still need that overarching architecture. All right, so we've got the layer helper. And I just call it that because it is strictly dealing with the architecture and the layers. And then we have our core, our general, and our web. Now with general, this is dealing with things like, well, let me show you. Circular dependencies is one that I've been working through for what their demos and documentation show. Is be free of cycles should be the thing you use for circular dependencies. However, when I go to run it, I need to work on the slicing a little bit better. Because right now it's like, well, hey, these two depend on each other, but it's like they're not related. So this is just showing you that if there are general rules I want to follow, you might want to put them in a general test. Or, better yet, maybe you're dealing with things by layers. So that's where my core and my web come into play. And core, that access tests, that's coming in a future NimblePros blog post where I talk about where the setters need to be private. So there's that. Oh, well, we'll talk about that here in a minute. So we'll go to layer dependency tests. That's fine. All right. So with our layer dependency tests, basically the screenshots you saw in the PowerPoint presentation are these iArch rules. And this is again why I pulled them out separately, is because we're going to use them elsewhere. So these are the different iArch rules where you can see, we're looking at the types, you get to look at the classes. Anything that are in this particular layer should not depend. Now, a question that comes up is naming conventions. How do we decide on the names? Go with the naming convention that makes sense for your standards. You might prefer this. You might prefer, I think in one of the other ones, you'll see where I use the underscores. So I think that's snake casing, if I remember correctly. We have a blog post for that. There's kebabs, which are hyphens, but go with the naming scheme that makes sense for you. So for me, you're going to see there's core should not depend on Blazor shared. So I'm very specific in my names. Also, be specific in your names to make it easy to go back to and go, oh, I know exactly what's happening here. Now, when I refactored those by pulling my Arch rules out, all I have to do is on the Arch rule, call check and pass in the architecture. That's how ArchUnitNet works. So, making sure that each one of these happens. Which is all fine and dandy, except, well, these could pass and one could fail, and it'd be okay, go back and deal with that one test. But the thing is, what if you need all of them to be true? And you didn't want to put them all in a test like this, maybe you wanted to test them all at once? You can do that. Now, for this example, where core should not depend on external layers, what you're seeing here is that I've got the different rules joined by and. Just so you can see, let's say dot and notice you can build off of and, or you can pass in the rules. So you could do and, then you could go and continue to build off of that as well. Now I'm not going to put that in there right now because we want this to actually pass. So this is the combined rule demo. Again, these are iArch rule types. If I go back to the top. So the other thing is if I forgot this using static, so I'm going to comment it out. We'll come back to it just so you can see. Things like types don't work or classes don't work. You look at the rules, you're like, why isn't this working? And then it's, if you see that red squiggle, it's just a matter of, oh yeah, don't forget to have your using static for the Arch rule definition. And this one, I don't use domains, so I'm just going to name it sort usings. Okay. The next one I want to show are naming tests. And you're going to see things that are passing and failing, because I don't always want to show happy path. I prefer to show you things that are broken and talk about those, because that's the reality of our day-to-day work. We're not always happy path. In fact, if everything was all happy path, would we really have jobs? At that point, it's just keep it working. We want to make sure that if we're dealing with production fires, we know how to put them out. So for this case, thankfully this is catching up before production, but we still need to make sure that we put these guardrails in place. So the rule I have here is that if they implement iAggregate root, they should have a name ending with aggregate. We saw this in the slides as it was failing. If I come here, you can see that it's failing. You'll see it's a failed arch rule exception, so that's the type of exception that you get when you're running the tests. And then every one of my iAggregate roots will end up failing this, with the exception of order. And let me show you why. The reason why I did that was because if I go into my source folder, my application core project, and I went into the order aggregate and I went to order, and I renamed it to order aggregate and said, yes, make those changes for me. See, order aggregate actually follows the rule I wanted. Now, what if I change that back? So we already know it's broken. So I'm going to rename it. And we're going to call it order like it is when you actually clone it. And do I want to perform the rename? Yes, please. I love that the IDEs take care of that pain for us. I'm going to save that. And then if I go back to my naming tests, we saw here that order was not in here. There's catalog brand, catalog item, catalog type, and so on. But there's no order there. So now if I tell it to go ahead and run, let's see, it's doing some things with the progress bar. Should show us that order fails that test because it is no longer called order aggregate. Now, this is one of the tricky things that I run with ArchUnitNet sometimes. So we'll see. Test Explorer. Test, it fails. There's order. Order, oops. Order is now in the list. So just so you can see that when I had order, I renamed it as aggregate, so it would not appear in there. But because we have this rule here, this is there. Let's see, what other rules did we want to take a look at while we're in here? So we looked at the aggregates and their naming. Repositories, similar deal. So you'll see I use either R assignable to and type of, or R assignable to and then the namespace spelled out. Either way is fine. Just so you can see what this is doing here. So you could say use regular expressions. So if you know regular expressions really well, you can get into using the different patterns for regex, and then you could tell it that it needs to, so I'll show you the override on that. Of course I'd show you the override and it gets cut off, but know that you can tell it that you're using regex here. You could tell it should have a name containing repository and it'll run. And then you could say if it implements it. Now sometimes you might not have a positive match, so it might complain, you might have to use it without requiring positive results to make it happier. Yeah. It gets tricky. All right. So we've looked at a closed core. We've looked at the naming tests. We've looked at layer dependency tests, making sure that those are there. And again with the web, just so you can see there was no screenshot magic. I even put in the comments that this should fail. This is intentional. But we're looking to see if it's in the web, it should not depend on Blazor admin. And there's my because of statement. And you'll see types that are should not include those because they should be independent. But then it says, oh yeah, by the way, no, these things depend on each other. So this, the way I would see it is I would take a look at this from a standpoint of what do we have code-wise, how do we fix it? And especially when it comes to something like authorization, that gets me even more nervous seeing that the authorization is an admin and we're referring to it in web. So we might want to take a look at that and see what's really going on in there and can we refactor it so there's proper separation. All right. So those are the tests I wanted to show. And like I said, there's one coming up in the NimblePro's future blog, probably within the next couple of weeks, on access tests as well. So making sure that our setters are private. Okay. That said, let's go back to our presentation. Any questions? Repo that we're using is eShop on web. And again, NimblePros is maintaining that. So if you have any questions or issues, feel free to open them and know that there are humans on the other side who are reviewing those. All right, so we looked at those, talked about the combined rules. Let's talk about some best practices and what to know with these. So make sure that you're using meaningful names. The last thing you want to do is come in on a Monday after enjoying your weekend and then find tests are failing and you're like, what was that test again? Be clear with what you're testing. So you can see here that my web doesn't depend on API, but oh, there's the admin. And use your test framework features. So today's demo showed XUnit. And because it's a smaller project, we don't have to worry about the traits, or like if you're using NUnit, you don't have to worry about categories, but you can get into that. You have both your both the framework and the ArchUnitNet code available. So you get to work with either of those or both of those at the same time. So understand that just because you're using ArchUnitNet doesn't mean that the XUnit features go away. You just combine them. So make use of traits if you need to, make use of skip if you need to. But you want to focus on high-value rules that are critical to business objectives or even to technical objectives, depending on who you're dealing with and how they prioritize things. Take advantage of CI/CD. I cannot stress this enough. Make use of the automation. And you can see in this particular one that we're doing things where we're doing a checkout, and then we're doing our build, and then we're doing our test. So we have tests as part of our CI/CD intentionally. If those tests fail, and then that means that your stuff doesn't get deployed, that means that you just let bad code stay there and not get deployed to production. So, it's a good thing. Less production fires. When you can, include documentation on your architecture tests. So if I come back to here, my tests, in the solution is a README. And did I go back and put the architecture test in here? I did not put it in this particular README yet because I'm still working on getting the branch in a way that I can get it out to all you. But what I would say is if there's a README, include the guidance on the architecture tests. Like, how should those tests be used? How are those tests organized? Because as a developer, if I'm coming into this code base, I need to know how to be able to contribute to the documentation as well. Speaking of documentation, keep your tests updated. This update the plan comes from DevIQ and talks about how if there's a plan and it needs to change, make sure you update that plan. Also applies to tests. also applies to documentation. So make sure that you keep these things updated. Now, you want to get started today with these tests. I promise you, it'll save you a lot of headache in the long run. It'll allow more readability, more maintainability to your code base. If you haven't gotten to the fundamentals of software architecture, they do talk about fitness tests. They talk about the circular dependencies as an example. So fundamentals of software architecture is a good one. However, if you really want to get more into architecture testing, then the one I highly recommend is this one, which is Building Evolutionary Architectures. And the screenshot I have here for the book cover is the second edition. I happen to pick it up in a Humble Bundle. If you don't know about Humble Bundle, humblebundle.com. They do run a series of books on sale that'll go for charity. And we're not talking about just random books, but also books by well-known publishers, including O'Reilly. So this is how I picked up the Building Evolutionary Architectures. What's nice about Humble Bundle is they are DRM free books, so you can put like PDFs on a remarkable reader. That's what I do. But Building Evolutionary Architectures, when it comes to these architecture tests, Chapter 2 focuses specifically on fitness tests, and there are more about tests and metrics throughout this book. Highly recommend it because it has such great information on how you work with architectures that have to evolve over time. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. My name is Sarah. Sarah Dukevich. So those emails that you get with the links to the video plus supporting links, you'll see it comes from Sarah from Nimble Pros. That's me. And you can find us easily if you go to bit.ly/contact-np, or that QR code does take you to our contact page, which will get you information. We'll gladly help you walk through implementing architectural testing or working with clean architecture. Maybe you're migrating to .NET 8 or .NET 9. So any of those reach. So there's a question in chat about are there any discounts for the books? None that I know of offhand. I would say if you're in O'Reilly, like O'Reilly.com's got their own platform, you'd be able to find those very easily. Local libraries. So local libraries usually carry copies of it as well. Overdrive has a Libby platform where you can get the books through the libraries that way. But for me, I highly recommend looking up humblebundle.com because they will have things from games development to software architecture to various other topics as well. I've seen design patterns too. Very reputable publishers in that space. So keep an eye out for that as well. And again, did I mention that some of those are DRM free, which means if you have a reader such as a Remarkable, works well on those. And for those of you who have already signed up on our website to get the thank you email, that thank you email will probably get to you in about a day or two because I want to make sure I have all the links in there and also make sure that I get the GitHub branch to eShop on Web so you can see these architecture tests that we demo here today. Yeah, so the question about that, so humblebundle.com. Usually great deals on books, goes towards charity. And like I said, that's how I found my copies of the two O'Reilly books. Truth be told, I have no O'Reilly problem, as in like my wallet's probably not big enough for the collection I used to have, and the collection that I have on the bookshelves behind me, and then keep putting out more good books. And so I take advantage of Humble Bundle when I can to kind of be gentle on the wallet. And again, those titles, we'll go back just so that you have those. I do include links to them. Our Building Evolutionary Architectures by Neil Ford, Rebecca Parsons, Patrick Qua, and Pramod Satalaj. And then Fundamentals of Software Architecture by Mark Richards and Neil Ford. All right, thank you all for tuning in. If you have any questions, please either feel free to respond to the email with all the links, or if you post in the comments, I'll try to get to those as quickly as I can. So thank you very much.